Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
You ever work your ass off for years, sacrificing your free time, your energy, your peace of mind, just to build something of your own, something that no one handed to you, something that came from nothing but your own sweat and sleepless nights, only to have someone look you straight in the eye and tell you they deserve it more than you do? Yeah, that was my family. I had spent the last 15 years grinding my way up from nothing, working jobs that drained me, putting in hours that never seemed to end, taking every opportunity that came my way. Also, I could finally reach a place where I didn't have to worry about money, where I didn't have to check my bank account before buying groceries, where I could sleep at night knowing my future was secure. I had built my own business, put every last dime I had into making it work, fought through every obstacle, and finally, I had made it. But my family? They saw my success as theirs. Especially my mother. I should have seen it coming. The signs had been there for years. Little comments slipped into conversations. Little reminders that family takes care of family. Little hints that my money wasn't really my own, but something to be shared, something I was obligated to give back. And it wasn't like I had never helped. I had covered rent when my parents were struggling, had loaned money to my brother when he swore he'd pay me back, had always been the one they turned to when things went wrong. But this time it wasn't a request. It was a demand. It started with a simple text from my mother. Come over. We need to talk. I almost ignored it, almost made up an excuse about being busy, almost let it sit there unread like I had done so many times before. But something in me knew better. Something in me recognized that tone, that carefully worded message, that particular kind of urgency that only came when they needed something from me. So like an idiot, I went. The moment I stepped into the house, I knew I had walked into something I wasn't prepared for. My mother was already sitting at the dining table, her hands folded in front of her, her expression carefully neutral, the way it always was when she was trying to control the conversation before it even started. My father was there too, but he looked uncomfortable, his eyes avoiding mine, his fingers tapping against the table like he wished he were anywhere else. And then there was Liam, slouched in his chair, looking like he had just rolled out of bed, his shirt wrinkled, his hair a mess, that same smug half-smile on his face that he always had, like the world owed him something just for existing. I didn't even sit down before I said it. What does he need now? My mother let out a slow breath, already bracing herself, already preparing for resistance, already trying to make me feel like the bad guy before I had even heard the request. Ethan, she said, her voice calm, measured, that same motherly tone she had used when I was a kid, and she wanted me to feel guilty for saying no. This isn't just about your brother. This is about family. About all of us. I crossed my arms, already exhausted, already waiting for the nonsense to start. Cut to the point, Mom. She hesitated for just a second, just long enough for me to notice, just long enough for me to know that whatever was coming next was worse than I thought. And then, with that same even tone, with that same practiced patience, she finally said it. Liam is in trouble. He owes some people a lot of money, and we need your help. I didn't even blink. Of course, he was in trouble. He was always in trouble. How much? I asked, already knowing I wasn't going to like the answer. She glanced at my father, who was still refusing to meet my eyes, and then back at me, her fingers tightening around each other like she was holding on for dear life. 200,000, she said finally, the words falling into the room like dead weight, suffocating, heavy, inescapable. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head, not even bothering to hide my disbelief. And you think I have that kind of money just lying around? We know you do, she said, her voice softer now, more careful, like she was trying to ease me into it, like she thought if she said it gently enough, it wouldn't sound insane. You're doing well, Ethan. You have a good job, a business, a house. We know you can afford it. I felt my jaw tighten, my pulse picking up speed, my fingers curling into my palms as the reality of what she was saying hit me full force. You're telling me that because I worked my ass off to build something, because I actually made something of myself, I should just hand over my salary to bail him out of his own stupidity? My mother's expression hardened, the patience slipping for just a second, the mask cracking just enough for me to see the entitlement underneath. We're family, she said, her voice sharper now, more insistent. And your success is ours to claim. That's how it works, Ethan. We take care of each other. I stared at her, at my father who still hadn't said a word, at Liam, who hadn't even pretended to look ashamed, and something inside me finally snapped. I laughed, a full, unrestrained laugh, the kind that comes from a place so deep, so exhausted, so completely done that there was no other reaction left to have. And that's when I said it. I think he owes you more than money now. They all froze. The room going completely silent, my mother's lips pressing into a thin line, my father finally looking up, Liam's eyes narrowing in sudden confusion. I leaned forward just slightly, my voice calm, almost amused, because this was the moment I had been waiting for. "Check the accounts I shared with him," I said, my smile cold, my tone light, like I wasn't about to destroy every illusion they had built in their heads. Liam paled. And that's when I knew. They had no idea what I had already uncovered. And this was just the beginning. I sat there watching them, my mother still trying to hold on to whatever control she thought she had, my father shifting uncomfortably in his seat, and Liam wasn't smiling anymore. That stupid, lazy confidence that he always carried. That smug assurance that no matter what he did, someone would always be there to clean up his mess, had finally cracked just enough for me to see the panic creeping in behind his eyes. He knew something was coming, he just didn't know how bad it was going to be yet. And honestly, I wanted to enjoy this moment, because I had spent years watching my family make excuses for him, years watching them bend over backward to shield him from consequences while telling me I had to be the responsible one, the strong one, the one who never asked for help, never made mistakes, never needed anything from anyone. And now, after everything I had done for them, they actually thought they could sit here and demand I hand over everything I had worked for just because Liam had, once again, screwed himself over. The worst part was, I wasn't even surprised. They had always bailed him out, always given him a way to avoid dealing with the damage he caused, always found some excuse to justify why he deserved another chance. Every failed job, every bad decision, every stupid scheme that crashed and burned, they never let him feel the weight of his own actions. And now, because they had let him become this, because they had spent his entire life making sure he never had to clean up his own mess, they were sitting here trying to pin it all on me. But this time was different. Because this wasn't just a few $1,000s lost at a casino, wasn't just some credit card debt that could be brushed under the rug, wasn't just another reckless mistake they could pretend never happened. This was over 200 grand. And it wasn't just gambling money. I knew that before I even walked in. I had known for weeks, had seen the signs, had started noticing little things that didn't add up, little red flags that made me go back and check something I should have looked at a long time ago. And what I found, it was worse than anything I could have imagined. Liam hadn't just been losing his own money. He had been losing mine. I had made the mistake of trusting him once a long time ago, back when I still thought maybe, just maybe, he would grow up, when I still believed that he would eventually become someone worth trusting. I had given him access to a joint account, an account meant for emergencies, an account I had barely touched in years because I had been too busy working, too busy building something real, too busy handling my own life to worry about what was happening to money I assumed was still there. But when I finally checked, that account was empty, drained, every last cent gone. I'll let my mother keep talking, let her keep spinning the same story, the same desperate plea, the same tired, guilt-laced argument about how I had to do this, because I was his brother, because family was supposed to help each other, because this was just money, just a problem that could be solved if I stopped being selfish and did the right thing. And I let her say it all, let her paint me as the villain, let her act like I was being unreasonable for not wanting to throw 200 grand into a bottomless pit. Because I was waiting for her to finish, waiting for the exact moment when I could drop the bomb that was going to destroy every excuse, every lie, every manipulative little speech she had prepared. And when she finally paused, when she finally took a breath, when she finally looked at me like she expected me to give in, I just leaned back, smiled, and said, "You might want to ask Liam where my money went first." The shift in the room was instant. My mother frowned, confused for half a second, already preparing to dismiss it, already opening her mouth to tell me that this wasn't about me, that this was about helping my brother. But Liam? Liam's face turned pale, because he knew exactly what I meant. And now, so did she. The room was silent for a long, stretched-out moment, the kind of silence that didn't just hang in the air but pressed down on it, thick and suffocating, heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. My mother's face twisted in confusion, her eyes darting between me and Liam, trying to make sense of what had just come out of my mouth, trying to find a way to dismiss it before it could settle in, before it could become real. My father still hadn't said a word, still hadn't met my eyes, still hadn't done anything but sit there like a man who wanted to disappear into the furniture and pretend this wasn't happening. And Liam? Liam looked like a man who had just realized the walls were closing in. I watched him, watched the way his face paled, watched the way his fingers twitched against the table, watched the way his mouth opened slightly like he wanted to say something, like he was about to start spinning another lie, another excuse, another desperate attempt to talk his way out of something that had already collapsed in on itself. I almost sat there and let him dig himself even deeper, almost waited for him to start talking so I could tear apart every single excuse before the words even finished leaving his mouth. But I was done waiting. I leaned forward, my voice calm, my expression blank, my patience long gone. "I'm not paying a damn dime," I said, my tone final, absolute, leaving no room for argument. Not for him, not for his debts, not for anything. I don't care who he owes money to. I don't care what kind of trouble he's in. And I sure as hell don't care what you think about it. My mother's head snapped toward me so fast I thought she might hurt herself, her expression shifting from confusion to anger in an instant, her lips pressing into a thin line, her eyes narrowing like she couldn't believe what she had just heard. "Ethan," she said, her voice sharper now, her tone cutting, like she was scolding a child instead of talking to the man who had been holding this family together for years. "You're being selfish. Liam is family. He needs you." I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound, something bitter and exhausted, something that had been sitting in my chest for years just waiting for the right moment to break free. "Selfish," I repeated, shaking my head slightly, letting the word roll around in my mouth like it was something foreign, something ridiculous, something that didn't belong to me. "You're calling me selfish?" Liam let out a breath, shaking his head, rolling his shoulders like this whole thing was just a mild inconvenience. Like none of this really mattered, like I was making a big deal out of nothing. Like he hadn't spent years stealing from me and still expected me to save him. "Come on, man," he said, letting out a dramatic sigh, leaning back in his chair with that same lazy, practiced smirk that had always gotten him out of trouble before, that same expression that had fooled my parents every single time. "It's just money." And that's when I snapped. I felt like a switch flipping in my head, like something sharp and final clicking into place, like every ounce of restraint I had been holding on finally slipped through my fingers and shattered on the floor. I slammed my hand down on the table, so hard the glasses rattled, my voice cold, my anger no longer simmering beneath the surface but boiling over, spilling into the air, filling every corner of the room. "You think it's just money?" I said, my voice low, my tone sharp enough to cut through steel. "You think the last 15 years of my life, the work, the sacrifices, the late nights, the stress, the hours I put into making something for myself, you think all of that is just money?" Liam flinched slightly, but quickly covered it up, quickly slipped back into that mask of his, that carefully crafted image of someone who had never faced real consequences a single day in his life. I turned to my mother, my hands clenched into fists, my voice unwavering. "You want me to pay off his debts? You want me to fix his mess? To throw away everything I worked for just so he doesn't have to suffer for his own mistakes?" I let out a slow, sharp breath, leaning forward, my next words calm, deliberate, lethal. "Go check the accounts?" The color drained from Liam's face, so fast, I thought he might pass out. My mother frowned, the anger flickering into something closer to concern, the first real sign of hesitation creeping into her eyes, the first tiny sliver of doubt cracking through the absolute certainty that she had walked into this conversation believing she was right. "What do you mean?" she asked slowly, carefully, like she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. I leaned back, watching her, waiting, letting the tension build, letting the silence stretch just long enough for it to become uncomfortable, just long enough for the realization to start setting in, just long enough for Liam to start panicking. Then I pulled out my phone, tapped a few times, and turned the screen toward them. "See for yourself," I said, my voice calm, controlled, almost amused now. My mother hesitated for half a second before reaching for her own phone, her fingers moving quickly, logging into the shared account she had probably forgotten even existed, the one Liam had convinced me to set up years ago for emergencies, the one I had assumed was sitting untouched until I had finally checked it last week. And the second her eyes landed on the balance, the second she saw the big, bold, glaring number sitting there in the negative, the second she realized that every cent I had ever put in there was gone, drained, stolen right out from under me, the air was sucked right out of the room. My father finally looked up, finally turned his head, finally acknowledged what was happening, his face blank, his expression unreadable. My mother's mouth opened and closed, her fingers tightening around her phone, her breathing unsteady, the color completely gone from her face. And Liam? Liam wasn't smiling anymore. I watched him, watched the way his entire body stiffened, watched the way his jaw clenched, watched the way his fingers twitched against the table like he was 1 second away from running. Because now, he knew exactly how deep he had buried himself. Now he knew this wasn't just about a gambling debt. Now he knew he was completely, absolutely, undeniably screwed. The second my mother's eyes landed on the screen, I saw it happen. I saw the moment realization crashed into her like a tidal wave, the moment the lie she had been holding on to unraveled right in front of her. Her fingers tightened around the phone, as if gripping it harder would somehow change the numbers staring back at her. As if maybe, just maybe, if she blinked enough times, she could force reality to shift into something else. But reality didn't shift. Because the money was gone. Not borrowed. Not misplaced. Drained. Every last cent of the emergency fund, every dollar I had put away over the years, every bit of security I had built for myself, had been funneled out of the account and into Liam's endless black hole of gambling and recklessness. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, she scrolled further. Her breathing hitched. Her fingers stopped moving. And for the first time in my life, I watched as my mother, the woman who had spent years defending Liam, excusing him, protecting him from consequences, turned pale with horror. Because it wasn't just money he had stolen. It was my name, my credit, my identity. She had found the fake withdrawals, the transactions that hadn't come from my card but still bore my name, the payments to online casinos, the wire transfers to sketchy gambling sites, the loans taken out under my information, all of it carefully hidden, all of it orchestrated behind my back, all of it proof that Liam hadn't just been reckless. He had committed fraud. She let out a sharp breath, one hand flying to her mouth as she turned to look at him, her voice barely above a whisper, shaking, fragile, like she already knew there was no excuse good enough to fix this. Liam, she choked out, her voice unsteady, her hands trembling. What did you do? Liam didn't answer right away. For the first time since this conversation started, he looked nervous. Not the kind of nervous you get when you lose a couple $100 in a bad bet. Not the kind of nervous you fake when you want to play innocent, but real, raw, undeniable panic. The kind that only hits when you finally understand just how deep you've buried yourself. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting between me, our mother, and the screen in front of her, like he was trying to find some kind of loophole, some way to twist this in his favor, some way to make this not his fault. Mom, he started, but his voice cracked, and for the first time in his life, he had nothing. No quick excuses. No slick manipulation. No smooth words to make it all go away. Because this time he had gone too far. I leaned back in my chair, watching him, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of what he had done settle in, letting him squirm under the crushing reality of what came next. This wasn't just some bad bet, I said finally, my voice quiet but firm, every word like a blade cutting through the room. This wasn't just a little debt you needed help with. You didn't just borrow money, Liam. You stole it. You forged documents. You committed fraud. Liam's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists, his whole body tensing like he wanted to lash out, like he wanted to turn this around on me, like he still thought there was a way out of this. But there wasn't, because he had been caught. And now he had to live with the consequences. The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping, anger spilling into the air like gasoline thrown onto an open flame, the weight of everything finally breaking apart into something raw and undeniable. My mother was the first to snap, her voice shaking, her hands gripping the phone so tightly I thought she might shatter it in her fingers, her entire body trembling like she could force this into something manageable if she just held on hard enough. "We can fix this," she said quickly, desperately, her voice rising, panic bleeding into every syllable, her eyes flicking between Liam and me like she was searching for some kind of way to glue this mess back together. "We'll find a way. We always do. We just need to." The only way out of this, I cut in sharply, my voice cold, my patience completely gone, my hands pressing into the table as I stood, my glare locked on a Liam like I could burn straight through him with nothing but my rage, is jail. Liam's head jerked toward me, his face contorting, his mouth opening like he wanted to protest, like he wanted to twist this into something else, like he still thought he had a way out. But there was nothing left for him to twist. My mother's breath hitched, her expression flickering from shock to horror. Her head shaking so fast it was almost frantic, like she couldn't even process what I had just said. "No," she breathed, almost like it was an automatic response, almost like the idea of Liam facing real consequences was impossible for her to comprehend. "No, Ethan, that's not. We're not calling the police, we're not letting this. You think we have a choice?" I snapped, my voice cutting through hers, my fists clenching, my entire body vibrating with the kind of fury that had been building for years. The kind of rage that had been waiting for the moment it could finally break free. "This isn't just some bad habit we can cover up, Mom. This is fraud. This is identity theft. The bank is already investigating, and when they finish, guess what? They're not going to come after me." Liam flinched. "They're going to come after him," I finished, pointing straight at him. watching as his face drained of color, watching as he tried to process the reality of what was happening, watching as the weight of it finally started to crush him. My father, who had been silent this entire time, suddenly exhaled sharply, like he was trying to push out something that had been stuck in his throat, like he had been holding back words he didn't want to say, words he had been avoiding for far too long. And then, finally, he looked at Liam, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with something even worse, with exhaustion, with the weight of a father realizing, maybe for the first time, that his son was never going to change. How long have you been lying to us, Liam? His voice was quiet, but heavy, the kind of tone that carried years of regret, years of denial, years of looking the other way. Liam didn't answer, because there was no answer that would fix this. No excuse that would erase what he had done. No lie that could cover the sheer, brutal truth of what he had become. My mother opened her mouth like she wanted to defend him, like she wanted to argue, like she still thought she could convince herself this wasn't what it looked like, but my father just shook his head, cutting her off before she could even start. No, he said firmly, his eyes never leaving Liam's, his expression unreadable, his voice steady in a way that made it clear this wasn't a conversation anymore. This was a verdict. Don't make excuses for him. Not this time. Liam swallowed hard, his hands twitching against the edge of the table, his leg bouncing, his whole body shifting like he was looking for an escape, like he was waiting for someone, anyone, to throw him a lifeline. But there weren't any lifelines left. There was nowhere left to run. And for the first time in his life, he was completely, utterly alone. I took a step forward, my voice lower now, controlled, dangerous in a way I had never let myself be before. You forged my signature, I said, each word slow, deliberate, designed to cut through whatever delusion he had left. You stole from me for years. And now, the bank is investigating fraud. Liam finally looked at me, his expression breaking for just a second, his mouth parting slightly like he wanted to beg, like he wanted to plead, like he still thought I would be the one to save him. But I just smiled, because this time, I was done saving him. The call from the bank came earlier than I expected, the voice on the other end calm, professional, methodical, completely unaware of the storm they had just stepped into. I sat in my office, the papers from my fraud claims spread across my desk, the weight of the past few weeks pressing into my shoulders like lead, my fingers gripping the phone just a little too tightly as I listened to the investigator lay it all out in brutal, undeniable detail. The transactions, the forged documents, the withdrawals in my name, the signatures that weren't mine. It was all there, neatly cataloged, every single fraudulent dollar traced back to one person. Liam. I had expected this, had known exactly what I would find when I first started digging, but hearing it confirmed, hearing a complete stranger tell me that my own brother had spent years systematically robbing me, stealing from me, betraying me in ways I hadn't even fully grasped until this moment. It hit different. But then the investigator kept going, and that's when everything cracked wide open. We also need to inform you, the voice continued, smooth, emotionless, completely detached, that similar fraudulent activity has been flagged on additional accounts linked to your family. I went completely still. What do you mean? I asked, my voice colder than I intended, sharper, tight with something I wasn't ready to name yet. A brief pause, the sound of papers shuffling, the investigator clearing their throat before continuing. We have identified a pattern of unauthorized withdrawals and forged signatures on accounts belonging to both your mother and father. While the amounts vary, the transactions follow a similar pattern to those found on your accounts. At this time, we believe the same individual, your brother, was responsible. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to process what I had just heard, forcing myself to acknowledge the reality that somehow, unbelievably, this was worse than I had imagined. Liam hadn't just stolen from me. He had stolen from them too. The very people who had spent their lives shielding him, defending him, covering for him, enabling him. And now, they were just as much victims as I was. The moment I hung up, I knew I wasn't going to keep this to myself. They needed to know. So I went back. I walked into that house one last time. My mother still pale, my father still sitting in stunned silence. Liam still looking like he was waiting for a miracle, waiting for someone to pull him out of the hole he had dug for himself. But this time, I wasn't coming to argue. I was coming to tell them exactly what was about to happen. The bank is filing a full report, I said, tossing the printed documents onto the table, watching as my mother flinched, watching as my father's eyes locked onto the papers like they held a bomb that was about to go off. They have enough evidence to move forward with fraud charges. And it's not just my accounts. It's yours too. Silence. Then, what? My mother's voice cracked, barely above a whisper, her fingers trembling as she reached for the papers, her eyes scanning the lines, her breath hitching when she saw the withdrawals, the missing funds, the proof that her golden son had bled them dry just as easily as he had done to me. Liam shifted in his chair, his mouth opening and closing, his hands twitching, his leg bouncing under the table. I was going to pay it back, he mumbled, his voice weak, defensive, like that excuse had ever worked before, like it was still worth something, like he actually believed it would fix this. My father finally spoke, his voice tired, raw. Like he was just now realizing that the son he had been trying to protect wasn't a screw-up, he was a thief. You took money from us too? Liam didn't answer, because there was no answer that wouldn't make this worse. That's when my mother turned to me, her eyes filled with something desperate, something broken, something that looked too much like hope. Ethan, please, she whispered, like she already knew what I was about to say, like she already knew that I wasn't going to give her the answer she wanted. You don't have to go through with this. We can handle it as a family. We don't have to let it get to that point. You can drop the claim. You can... No. The word came out flat, cold, final. She flinched. Mom, I said, my voice softer now, but no less firm, no less unwavering, no less absolute. He's not just in debt. He's not just struggling. He's a criminal. He stole from all of us. And now, he's going to pay for it. Liam shot up from his seat, panic flooding his face, his hands slamming against the table as he tried to salvage what little control he had left. Come on, man. You don't have to do this. He snapped, his voice cracking, his mask slipping, his desperation finally clawing its way to the surface. I'm your brother. I met his eyes, steady, unshaken, completely unaffected by the plea I had heard too many times before. Yeah, I said. And look what you did with that. The audience question. Would you send your own brother to jail? The call came early in the morning, the kind of call that, even before you pick up is going to change something, is going to pull you into a moment you can't take back, is going to close a door that can never be opened again. I stared at the screen for a second, my fingers hovering over the answer button, my stomach twisting. Not with doubt, not with regret, but with the kind of exhaustion that comes when you finally understand that there is no coming back from this, that what has been broken cannot be fixed. I answered on the third ring, the voice on the other end sharp, direct, professional. Mr. Carter, we wanted to inform you that charges have been officially filed against Liam Carter. He is scheduled for arrest later today. I exhaled slowly, my grip tightening around the phone, my jaw clenching just slightly before I forced myself to relax, to breathe, to push past the weight of what I had already known was coming. Thank you, I said simply, my voice steady, my pulse even, my decision absolute. This was happening. Liam was going to jail, and I wasn't going to stop it. The news must have traveled fast, because less than an hour later, my phone was ringing again, the same caller ID flashing across the screen, the same name I'd seen 1,000 times before, the same number that used to mean home, family, something safe. My mother. I let it ring for a moment, my fingers flexing against the arm of the chair, my eyes staring blankly at the wall, my mind already running through exactly what this conversation was going to be. I already knew what she would say, already knew how she would twist this, how she would try to make this my fault, how she would refuse to see the truth staring her right in the face. But I answered anyway, and the second I did, the screaming started. You could have handled this privately, she shouted, her voice high, shrill, filled with something that wasn't sadness but pure, unfiltered rage. You didn't have to go to the police. You didn't have to let it get this far. How could you do this to your own brother? I let her go on. Let her throw every accusation, every insult, every desperate attempt to shift the blame off of the son she had spent her entire life protecting. I let her tell me I had ruined the family. Let her call me cruel. Let her say that I had destroyed Liam's life. And then, when she finally took a breath, I said the one thing that she refused to acknowledge, the one thing that had been true from the very beginning. How could he do this to me? The silence on the other end was immediate, sharp, suffocating, like the air had been sucked straight out of her lungs. I leaned forward, my voice calm, my words slow, controlled, deliberate, pressing into the cracks of every excuse she had ever made for him. He stole from me, I said, my tone even, unwavering, leaving no room for argument. He forged my name, he drained my accounts, he gambled away my money, and I didn't say a word. I let it go. I let it go every single time, Mom. I could hear her breathing, shallow, uneven, like she was trying to come up with something, trying to find a way to turn this around, trying to convince herself that Liam was still the victim in all of this. But this, I continued, my voice dropping lower, sharper, filled with something heavier than anger, something closer to resignation. This isn't something I can forgive. This isn't just a mistake. This isn't something you can fix. Liam did this to himself. And if you can't see that, then maybe you should ask yourself why. Her breath hitched slightly, but then the anger came back. Family forgives, she spat, her voice shaking, her desperation turning into something venomous, something ugly, something she had probably been holding on to for years. But you're not family. Not anymore. I felt something in my chest tighten for just a second, something that might have hurt if I hadn't already seen this coming, if I hadn't already known that this was where we were heading, if I hadn't already accepted that there was no going back. I nodded to myself, exhaling slowly, letting the last thread between us snap. Yeah, I said simply, my voice quiet but firm. I figured, then I hung up. And this time, I didn't feel guilty. Not even a little. By the time I arrived at my parents' house, the place was a mess of tension. The air thick with something that felt almost suffocating, the weight of what was about to happen pressing into every corner, every inch of space between us. My father was standing in the doorway, his shoulders heavy, his face unreadable, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Not anger, not sadness, but something closer to surrender. I stopped in front of him, waiting, watching, giving him the chance to say whatever it was he had been holding on to, whatever it was that had kept him silent for so long. And then, finally, he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, his voice quiet, exhausted, defeated. We let him become this, he admitted, his words slow, careful, guilt-ridden in a way I had never heard before. This is our fault. I stared at him, my jaw tightening, my hands curling into fists, the anger in my chest flashing hot, sharp, relentless. Then why did you let me take the fall for it? He didn't have an answer. Because there wasn't one. And then, just like that, the sirens came, the flashing lights, the knock on the door, the officers stepping inside. And Liam? Liam finally realizing that no one was going to save him this time. I watched as they put the cuffs on him, watched as my mother begged, pleaded, screamed, watched as she turned on me, her words sharp, accusing, filled with the kind of hatred that only comes from someone who refuses to accept the truth. But I didn't react. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just stood there, watching, silent as the house I was never going to step foot in again. And when it was over, when the door shut behind them, when my mother collapsed into a chair, sobbing, cursing my name, I turned and walked away. And I never looked back. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that settled into the walls, pressing against the air like a heavy weight, thick and unmoving, stretching into every corner of the space I had once worked so hard to build. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one I had eaten at for years, the same one where I had gone over budgets, made plans for the future, mapped out my life with careful precision, only for it all to be torn apart by the people who were supposed to stand beside me. The bank statement sat in front of me, the numbers staring back like a final, undeniable truth, a brutal confirmation of everything I had lost. The money was gone, every last cent drained, every account wiped clean, every bit of security I had spent years building cashed out and thrown away by the brother who had never once thought about what it would cost me. I had fought for this, for my future, for my own damn survival. But now, sitting here in the wreckage of what should have been a victory, I couldn't help but wonder if winning was supposed to feel this empty. I reached for the glass in front of me, the whiskey burning as it slid down my throat, the taste sharp, bitter, grounding in a way that almost made me forget what had led me here, almost made me forget the look in my mother's eyes as they took Liam away, almost made me forget the way she had screamed my name like I was the one who had betrayed her, like I was the one who had destroyed our family, like I was the villain in a story where I had only ever been the victim. She had looked at me like she didn't even recognize me anymore, like I was a stranger. And maybe I had been fooling myself for years, pretending that we were something we had never really been, holding on to an idea of family that had only ever existed in my head. Maybe I had spent too long chasing something that was never mine to begin with, desperate to belong to people who had never truly seen me as one of their own. I let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over my face, my fingers pressing against my temples as the exhaustion settled deeper, as the weight of everything pressed harder, as the silence stretched further, until suddenly it was broken. The phone rang, a single, sharp sound cutting through the stillness, pulling me out of my thoughts, dragging me back to the present whether I wanted to be there or not. I stared at the screen for a moment, my pulse steady, my breathing even, my body still frozen in place as I read the name flashing across the screen. Mom! I should have ignored it. I should have turned the phone over, let it go to voicemail, let the distance between us grow wider, let the silence stay unbroken. But instead, before I could stop myself, before I could talk myself out of it, before I could remind myself of everything she had said, I answered. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of her breathing, shaky, uneven, hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should speak, like she wasn't sure if I would even listen, like she was trying to find the right words and realizing too late that there were none. And then finally she spoke. Ethan, her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, the kind of voice she used when she was trying to make me feel something, the kind of voice she used when she wanted me to believe she was still my mother, that we were still a family, that there was still something left between us that hadn't been burned to the ground. Please. My fingers tightened around the phone, my jaw clenching, my chest tightening, my pulse hammering in a way that made me hate myself, because I already knew what she was going to say. He's still your brother. I let out a slow breath, my eyes shutting for just a second, my head tilting back, my free hand dragging over my face as the words sank in, as the weight of them settled into my bones, as the reality of this moment crashed into me like a tide I had been trying to outrun for years. She wasn't calling to apologize. She wasn't calling to say she understood. She wasn't calling because she had finally realized that everything I had done, everything I had fought for, everything I had sacrificed wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. No. She was calling because she still expected me to fix it. Even now, even after everything, I was still supposed to be the one who saved him. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening around the phone, my mind racing through 1,000 different responses, 1,000 different things I could say, 1,000 different ways I could end this conversation before it even really began. I could hang up. I could tell her no. I could tell her that Liam had never been my brother, that the moment he had stolen from me, the moment he had lied to me, the moment he had looked me in the eye and still expected me to clean up his mess, he had made his choice. I could tell her that this was the last time we would ever speak, that I was done, that I was never coming back. But instead, I hesitated. The screen fades to black. Did he do the right thing? Should he have let Liam suffer the consequences? Could you forgive family after this?